Carl Jung said something that shocked the entire world. Not in a lecture, not in a paper, on live television, watched by millions. The interviewer asked him directly, "Do you believe in God?" Jung paused, looked at the camera and said, "I don't need to believe. I know." 4 words more radical than anything an atheist could say. He didn't say faith. He said he knew, because you don't believe in something you have met. So what exactly did he know? Not the God of religion. Something he encountered directly, in his own depths. Today we go into what Jung actually discovered, and how a human being can enter genuine contact with the God image. Stay until the end, because Jung's final conclusion about God is the most surprising and important thing he ever said. 1. Jung was not an atheist. He was something more threatening. Let's establish this immediately, because the misreading is almost universal. People who haven't read Jung assume he reduced God to psychology, that he explained God away as a projection of the unconscious, a comforting fiction the human mind creates to manage its terror of mortality and meaninglessness. This is the opposite of what he actually believed. Jung's position was not that God is merely psychological. It was that the psychological is the primary domain through which the divine is encountered. The distinction is everything. A hallucination is merely psychological. It points to nothing beyond the mind that produced it. But a window is also a psychological experience. Light hitting the retina, signals processed by the brain, and yet what it reveals is genuinely outside. Jung believed the God image, the overwhelming, numinous, terrifying, transformative presence that human beings across every culture and every century have encountered in their depths, was a window, not a projection onto nothing, a perception of something real, mediated through the only instrument available to human beings for perceiving anything: the psyche. This is why he said he knew rather than believed. Belief is what you hold about something you cannot directly experience. Knowledge, in the sense Jung meant, is what remains after direct encounter. And Jung had that encounter, not once, many times, in dreams, in visions, in the terrifying years he described in the Red Book, when the depths opened beneath him and he descended into them deliberately, with a scientist's courage and a mystic's openness, to find out what lived there. What he found was not a concept, it was a presence. 2. The God Jung actually encountered. In 1952, near the end of his life, Jung published a book that cost him friendships, professional relationships, and the respect of colleagues he had spent decades building trust with. He called it Answer to Job. It was the most personally revealing, most theologically radical, most psychologically explosive thing he ever wrote, and he knew it would be. He published it anyway. In it, Jung did something no serious psychologist had done before. He read the Book of Job, the ancient story of a righteous man subjected to undeserved, catastrophic suffering by a God who seemed simultaneously all-powerful and morally inferior to the human being he was tormenting. And he took it seriously, not as allegory, not as myth to be decoded, as a psychological document describing a real encounter between a human being and the divine. And his conclusion was devastating. God, as encountered in the depths of the human psyche, is not all good. God is whole. Which means God contains what we would call darkness as well as light, destruction as well as creation, chaos as well as order, the terrifying as well as the beautiful. This is not atheism. This is the most serious possible engagement with the reality of the divine. Jung observed that every authentic religious tradition, beneath its official theology, carries this knowledge. The God of the Old Testament who commands genocide and the God who weeps with his people are the same God. The Shiva who destroys and the Shiva who dances are the same figure. The God of love and the God who allows children to suffer in ways no human court would permit are, in Jung's framework, the same reality. And the encounter with this wholeness, with a divine reality that is not safely, comfortably good, is what genuine contact with God actually feels like. Not the warm reassurance of institutional religion, something far older, far more destabilizing, far more real. 3. Why the Church made God too small. Jung had deep respect for religious tradition. He was not anti-religious. He was arguably more deeply religious than most theologians. But he had a specific, precise critique of what institutional religion had done over centuries to the God image. It had made God safe. By insisting on God's absolute goodness, absolute perfection, absolute benevolence, theology had, paradoxically, reduced God, had created a figure that matched human moral preferences rather than the overwhelming, amoral, beyond good and evil reality that mystics in every tradition had actually encountered. The mystics knew. Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, the authors of the Upanishads, the Sufi poets. Every genuine mystic in every tradition described an encounter with the divine that was terrifying as much as it was beautiful. That shattered the self before it expanded it. That demanded everything before it gave anything. Jung called this quality numinosity, Rudolf Otto's term for the specific quality of genuine religious experience. The mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that simultaneously terrifies and fascinates. That makes you want to flee, and makes it impossible to look away. This is not the experience most people have in church, or in the comfortable spiritual practices of modern wellness culture. It is the experience of Job, of Moses removing his sandals before a burning bush, of Isaiah crying, "Woe is me," at the vision of the divine, of Paul knocked from his horse on the road to Damascus. Jung's critique was not that religion is false. It was that most religion has replaced the encounter with a description of the encounter, has replaced the living, dangerous, transformative reality with a set of propositions about it. And the person who has only the propositions, who has never been in the presence of the numinous itself, has religion without God. 4. The self, Jung's name for what you've been calling God. Here is Jung's most radical psychological claim, the one that created the most controversy and continues to be misunderstood. At the center of the human psyche, deeper than the ego, deeper than the personal unconscious, deeper even than the archetypal layer of the collective unconscious, Jung identified a organizing presence he called the self. Not the self in the ordinary sense of personal identity, the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, the center and the circumference simultaneously, the archetype of wholeness that is always already present and is always calling the ego toward integration. And then Jung said, the thing that made theologians uncomfortable and scientists furious. The self, as experienced psychologically, is functionally indistinguishable from the God image. Not identical to God, Jung was always careful about this distinction. He was a psychologist, not a theologian, and he could only speak about what was psychologically real, not about ultimate metaphysical reality. But the experience of the self, when a human being genuinely encounters this deeper center through dreams, through active imagination, through genuine psychological crisis and transformation, has exactly the qualities that every religious tradition associates with the experience of God. Overwhelming, humbling, beyond the ego's control or comprehension, demanding, transformative, impossible to encounter fully and remain unchanged, oriented toward wholeness rather than the ego's preferences, capable of producing suffering in service of growth that the ego would never choose for itself. The encounter with the self is, in Jung's framework, the encounter with God, as far as any human being can psychologically reach. And the path to that encounter is not through belief. It is through the descent into your own depths that most people spend their entire lives carefully avoiding. 5. What blocks the conversation? Jung was precise about this. The primary obstacle to genuine contact with the God image, with the self at the center of the psyche, is not sin in the theological sense. It is inflation of the ego. The ego, the conscious self, the I that plans and speaks and manages your daily life, has a fundamental tendency toward a specific mistake. It believes it is the center. It organizes everything around its own preferences, its own comfort, its own survival and status, and self-image. It filters every experience through the question, is this good for me, as I currently understand myself to be? And this orientation, entirely natural, entirely human, entirely necessary up to a point, is precisely what prevents the deeper encounter. Because the self is not organized around the ego's preferences, it is organized around wholeness. And wholeness includes what the ego has rejected, suppressed, denied, and projected outward. The shadow, the unlived life, the qualities that were trained out of you, the desires that were shamed, the grief that was never expressed. All of this is held by the self, which is trying, constantly, to return it to consciousness, not to punish, to complete. The ego experiences this pressure as threat, as the emergence of unwanted material, as the disruption of carefully maintained self-image, and it resists. This resistance, the ego's insistence on remaining the center, on maintaining control, on deciding in advance what is acceptable to experience, is the wall between you and the conversation you are trying to have. Jung's path to God, and this is the part most people find unacceptable, runs directly through the dismantling of the ego's claim to centrality. Not the destruction of the ego. You need it. Without it, you dissolve. But its dethronement, its willing subordination to something larger. In religious language, every tradition has a version of this. Die before you die. Lose yourself to find yourself. Surrender. In Jungian language, ego death as the prerequisite for encounter with the self. The conversation with God begins when you stop insisting that you already know what God should sound like. 6. How the conversation actually happens. Jung was not mystical about the method. He was, to the end, a doctor, interested in what actually worked and what could be practically described. And his decades of clinical experience, his own inner journey, and his study of every major religious and alchemical tradition produced a framework that is consistent across all of them. The conversation happens in the same places it has always happened. In dreams. The night world, where the ego relaxes its control and the deeper layers of the psyche speak without censorship, is the primary channel. Jung believed that if you pay attention to nothing else, pay attention to your dreams. They are the nightly communication from the self, from the deeper center, about what is actually happening in your psychological life, what is being asked of you, what is trying to emerge. The God of dreams is not the God of doctrine. The God of dreams gives you exactly what you need, and almost never what you expected. In genuine suffering. Every tradition agrees on this. Jung agreed most of all. The moments of genuine psychological crisis, the collapse that cannot be reasoned away, the loss that cannot be managed, the confrontation with your own darkness that leaves no escape route. These are the moments when the ego's defenses are finally insufficient. And in the space that opens when the defenses fail, something else becomes audible. Not always immediately, not always clearly, but the crisis, when it is genuinely lived rather than escaped, is almost always, in retrospect, the moment the conversation began. In the numinous encounter. This can happen anywhere. In nature, in music, in a line of poetry that stops your breath, in a dream image that stays with you for years. In a moment of stillness so complete that something beyond ordinary consciousness becomes briefly, unmistakably present. Jung called these encounters with the numinous, and he believed they were not manufactured by the psyche but received by it. Glimpses of the reality the self is oriented toward, invitations to take the inner life as seriously as the outer one. Inactive imagination. The practice Jung developed for direct dialogue with the unconscious, entering a state of relaxed, focused attention and allowing the figures of the inner world, the dream characters, the shadow, the anima or animus, ultimately the self itself, to speak, not directing them, not controlling the outcome, listening, genuinely, openly, with the willingness to hear what you did not expect and did not plan. This is the closest Jung came to describing prayer as a psychological practice, not petition to an external deity. Direct, honest, open dialogue with the depth that knows more about you than your conscious mind ever will.